The Hardy Boys, The House on the Cliff, Chapter 11, Cliff Watchers. "Frank," Joe exclaimed, "I think you've hit it. That man had no reason to act the way he did unless he's covering up something." "Something like smuggling, you mean?" said Chet. "He must be Snapman or one of his gang." "And," Frank went on, "the fact that he was in that cove must mean he has some connection with the house on the cliff." "Snapman, king of smugglers," Tony whistled. "You guys really get in interesting situations." "I'll bet that'd be one of the fellows who chased Jones that day on the motorboat," Joe cried. "And tried to kill him," Frank continued the thought. "Let's get away from here," Chet urged. "Why should we go now?" Frank demanded. "We've stumbled on something important. That hidden pond may be the smuggler's base." "But if they use the house, how do you get into it?" Tony asked. "Those cliffs from up the pond were mighty steep." "There must be some other way that we couldn't see," Joe said. "What say we hang around here for a while and find out what we can?" Tony caught the Hardys' enthusiasm and agreed to keep the motorboat in the vicinity of the cliff. "That fellow may be keeping his eye on us, and we don't want him to know that we're watching the place," Frank observed. "Let's run back to the bay and cruise up and down a while, and then return." Chet sighed. "I'm glad none of you argued with that armed man." "Right," Joe replied. "As it is, he must think we were simply out for a cruise and wandered into the tunnel by mistake." "Yes," his brother agreed. "If he'd known we'd hunting for Dad, he might have acted very differently." In the late afternoon, Tony took the Napoli back to the suspected shore spot. Keeping well out from the breaking waves, he cruised along the cliff. The boys kept a sharp eye on the location of the tunnel. As the boat passed it, they were just able to distinguish the narrow opening in the rock. "I won't be able to go in there after a while," Tony remarked. "The tide is coming in. At high tide, I'll bet the tunnel is filled with water." Suddenly, Tony swung his craft so hard to the right that the other boys lost their balance. "Sorry, fellows," he said. "I saw a log. Oh!" He shut off his engine in a flash and leaned over the gunwale. His companions picked themselves up and asked what had happened. "Propeller started to foul up with some wire on that log." Tony began to peel off his clothes. "Get me some pliers, will you?" Frank opened the locker and found a pair. Taking them, Tony dived overboard. A minute later he reappeared and climbed in. "I'm lucky," he said. "Just plain lucky. 2 seconds more and all that wire would have been wound around the prop and the log would have been knocked it off." "Well, good night," Chet exclaimed. "It would have been a long swim home." Joe slapped Tony on the back. "Good work, boy. I'd hate to see the Napoli out of commission." Chet and Frank hauled the log aboard so it would not damage any other craft. "This is a fence post with barbed wire," Chet said. "Wowee! It's good you spotted that log, Tony." Tony dressed, then started the engine. He cruised around for more than an hour, but the boys saw no sign of life about the base of the cliff. They could see the Pollitt house, but to their amazement no lights appeared in it as twilight came. "How much longer do you think we should stay out here?" Chet asked. "I'm getting hungry." "I have a few pretzels and a candy bar, but that's not much for the 4 of us," Joe remarked. "Aha!" cried Tony. "I have a surprise for you. I stowed away a little food before we took off." With that, he pulled a paperback from the locker and passed each boy a large sandwich, a piece of chocolate cake, and a bottle of lemon soda. "You deserve a medal," Chet remarked as he bit into a layer of ham and cheese. "You sure do," Frank agreed. "I think we should stay right here for a while and watch. It's my guess the smugglers will be on the job tonight. Don't forget that the Marco Polo is docking tomorrow morning." "I get it," said Chet. "If she lays offshore or streams in slowly, it'll give Ali Singh a chance to drop the stolen drugs overboard the Snapman." "Correct," said Frank. Tony looked intently at the Hardys. "Is it your idea to keep Snapman from meeting Ali Singh? But what about your father? I thought we came out here to get a line on how to rescue him." The brothers exchanged glances. Then Joe said, "Of course it's our main purpose, but we hope we can do both." Twilight deepened into darkness, and lights could be seen here and there through the haze. The cliff was only a black smudge, and the house above was still unlighted. Suddenly the boy heard a muffled sound. Tony slowed the Napoli, and they listened intently. "Another motorboat," Tony whispered. The sound seemed to come from near the cliff. Straining their eyes in that direction, the four were at least able to distinguish a faint moving light. "Can you head over that way, Tony?" Frank said in a low voice. "And could you take a chance on turning off your lights?" "Sure, here goes. The wind's blowing from the land, so our engine won't be heard from the shore." The boys were tense with excitement as the Napoli moved towards the light. As the boat crept nearer the cliff, they could barely distinguish the outline of a motorboat. The craft seemed to be making its way carefully out of the face of the cliff. "It must have come from the tunnel," Joe whispered to Frank. "Yes." The Napoli went closer, in imminent danger of being discovered or being washed ashore onto the rocks. Finally the other boat slowed to a crawl. Then came a faint clatter of oars and low voices. The motorboat had evidently met a rowboat. The next moment, with an abrupt roar, the motorboat turned and raced out to the sea at an ever-increasing rate of speed. "Where can it be going?" said Tony in amazement. "Out to meet the Marco Polo?" "Probably," Frank replied, "and we'd never catch it." "I wonder where the rowboat's going." The four boys waited in silence for several minutes. Then the rattle of oars came again. This time the sound was closer. The rowboat was coming towards them. "What'll we do now?" Tony asked. "Turn off your engine," Frank whispered. Tony complied. Through the gloom suddenly came snatches of conversation from the rowboat. £100, they heard a man say harshly, and then the rest of the sentence was lost. There was a lengthy murmur of voices, then, "I don't know, it's whiskey." The wind died down. Just then two voices could be heard distinctly. "Ali Singh's share," one man was saying. "That's right, we can't forget him," the gruff voice replied. "I hope they get away all right." "What are you worrying about? Of course they'll get away." "We've been spotted, you know." "It's all your imagination. Nobody suspects." "But those boys at the house, they're just dumb kids. If they come nosing around again, we'll knock them on the head." "I don't like this rough stuff. It's dangerous." "We've got to do it, or we'll end up in the pen. What's the matter with you tonight? You're nervous." "I'm worried. I've got a hunch we better clear out of here." "Clear out?" replied the others contemptuously. "Are you crazy? Why, this place is as safe as a church." The man laughed sardonically. "Haven't we got all the squealers locked up? And tonight we make the big clean-up and get away." "Well, maybe you're right," said the first man doubtfully, "but still." His voice died away as the boat entered the tunnel. Joe grabbed Frank's arm. "Did you hear that? All the squealers locked up. I bet Dad's one of them, and he's prisoner somewhere around here." "And this is the hideout of Snapman and the other smugglers he was after," Frank added. "I don't like this," Chet spoke up. "Let's leave here and get the police." Frank shook his head. "It would take too long. We might goof off the whole thing. I tell you what, Joe and I will follow that rowboat through the tunnel." "How?" "On foot or swim. I don't think it's deep along the edges." "You mean Chet and I will wait here?" Tony asked. "No," Frank answered. "You two beat it back to Bayport and notify the Coast Guard. Tell them we're on the track of smugglers and ask them to send some men here." And tell them our suspicions about Ali Singh and the Marco Polo, Joe added. They can radio the captain to keep an eye on him. Okay, said Tony, I'll do that. First, I'll put you ashore. Don't get too close, or you will hit those rocks and wreck the boat, Frank warned. Joe and I can swim to shore. Then we will work around into the tunnel and we see what we can find. If we do discover anything, we will wait at the entrance and show the men from the Coast Guard where to go and when they get here. Tony edged the boat in as close as the dark shore as he dared without light. Quickly Frank and Joe took off their slacks, t-shirts, sweaters and sneakers. They rolled them up and with twine, which Tony provided, tied the bundles on top of their heads. Then they slipped over the side into the water. The Napoli sped off. Frank and Joe were only a few yards from the rocks after a short swim, emerged on the mainland. Well, here goes, Joe whispered, heading for the tunnel. Chapter 12. The Secret Passage. Cautiously, Frank and Joe made their way across the slippery rocks. Suddenly there was a loud splash as Joe lost his footing. "Are you all right?" Frank whispered as he came up where his brother was standing in the shallow water at the edge of the cliff. "Yes, for a moment I sure thought I'd sprained my ankle," Joe replied tensely, "but it seems to be okay now." "Give me your hand," Frank whispered, and quickly pulled Joe back onto the rocks. The Hardys had landed at a point some 25 yards from the tunnel opening, but the climb over the treacherous rock was so difficult that the distance seemed much longer. It was very dark in the shadow of the steep cliff. The waves breaking against the rocks had a lonely and foreboding sound. "Well, good night," Joe muttered. "Aren't we ever coming to that tunnel?" "Take it easy," Frank advised. "It can't be that much further." "I hope Tony and Chet will hurry back with help," Joe said. "This is a ticklish job." "If anybody's on guard there, we'll be certainly at a disadvantage," Frank remarked in a barely audible tone. "Watch out." By this time they had reached the entrance of the tunnel. After a few cautious steps, they discovered that the narrow piece of land between the water and the base of the cliff was covered by a thick growth of bushes. Frank turned to Joe. "If we try to walk through all this stuff," he whispered, "we sure be to be heard. That is, if those men are in some place." Joe grunted in agreement. "So what shall we do?" Tentatively, Frank put out foot into the water from the rock on which he was standing. "It isn't deep," he said. "I guess we can wade through." The boys hugged the wall and started off. Fortunately, the water came only to their knees because there was a shelf of rocks all the way along. The brothers' hearts beat wildly. What would they find ahead of them? The boys had not heard a sound since entering the tunnel. It appeared that the man in the rowing boat had gone on to some secret hiding place. "I think I will risk using my flashlight," Frank said in a low voice as they reached the pond. "We can't find anything without it." He pulled one he always carried from his waterproof case and snapped it on. The yellow beam shone over the pond. There was no sign of the rowboat. "How do you think those men get out of here?" Joe asked. "Do you suppose there is another opening?" Frank turned the flashlight onto the steep side surrounding the water. "I don't see any. My guess is that those men hid the boat someplace. Let's make a thorough search." Slowly the brothers began to walk around the edge of the pond, brushing aside the heavy growth and peering among the bushes. They had about given up in despair as they reached a section by the far wall of the tunnel. Then, as Frank beamed the flashlight over the thicket, he exclaimed hoarsely, "Look! A door!" Joe whispered tensely. The door had been so cleverly concealed that it would not have been seen in the full daylight, except at close quarters. The glare of the flashlight, however, brought the artificial screen of branches and leaves into sharp relief against the dark cliffside. "Well, this explains it," Joe said. "The man in the boat went through here." I wonder where it goes. In order to avoid detection, Frank extinguished his light before trying to open the door. He swung it open inch by inch, half expecting to find lights and people beyond. But there was only darkness. Luckily, the door had made no noise. Frank turned on his light again. Ahead was a watery passageway, some 10 feet wide and 25 feet long, with a ledge running along each side. At one end was a tiny wharf, with a rowboat tied to a post. "This is fantastic," Joe whispered, "and it must have been here a long time. Do you suppose it's connected with the Pollitt place?" "If it is, it could mean old Mr. Pollitt was mixed up with the smugglers," Frank answered. "Hey, do you suppose Snapman is his nephew?" Excited over the possible new angle to the case, Frank and Joe stepped onto the ledge. They dressed, then quietly inched forward. Reaching the wharf, they looked about them as Frank beamed his flashlight onto the walls. "Hold it," Joe whispered. Directly ahead was a crude arch in the rock. Beyond it the boys could see a steep flight of stone steps. Their hearts pounded with excitement. "We found it," Frank whispered. "This must be the secret passageway." "Yes," Joe agreed, "and from the distance we've come to figure it was right underneath the house on the cliff. Let's go up." The last light cast strange shadow in the passage through the rocks. Water dripped from the walls. The boys tiptoed forward and stealthily began the ascent. As they crept up the stairs, Frank flashed the light ahead of them. Shortly they could see that the steps had ended at a heavy door. Its framework was into the wall of rocks. Above them was only a rocky ceiling. When Frank and Joe reached the door, they hesitated. Both were thinking, if we go through that door and find a gang of smugglers, we'll never get out. But, on the other hand, we must find Dad. Frank stepped forward, pressed his ear against the door, listened intently. There was not a sound beyond. He turned off his light and looked carefully around the sides of the door to see if he could catch a glimmer of any illumination from the other side. There was only darkness. "I guess there is no one inside," he said to Joe. "Let's see if we can open it." Frank felt for the ledge. The door did not move. "It must be locked," he whispered. "Try it again. Maybe it's just stuck." Frank put his hand on the ledge, this time also pushing the door with his shoulder. Suddenly, with a noise which echoed from wall to wall, the ledge snapped and the door swung open. Joe stepped forward, but Frank put out a restraining hand. "Wait," he cautioned. "That noise may bring someone." Tensely, they stood alert for the slightest sound, but none came. Hopefully that there was no one in the area beyond, Frank switched on the flashlight. The vivid beam cut the darkness and revealed a gloomy cave, hewn out of the rock in the very center of the cliff. The boys wondered if it had been a natural cave. It was filled with boxes, bales, and packages distributed about the floor and piled against the walls. Smuggled goods, Frank and Joe thought. The fact that the majority of the boxes bore labels of foreign countries seemed to verify the suspicion. Convinced that the cave was unoccupied, the boys stepped through the doorway and looked for another door or opening. They saw none. Was this the end of the trail? But it couldn't be, the young sloths thought. Those men went someplace. Bolts of beautiful silk had been tossed on top of some of the bales. Valuable tapestries were also lying carelessly around. In one corner 4 boxes were piled on top of one another. Frank accidentally knocked the flashlight against one of these, and it gave forth a hollow sound. "It's empty," he whispered. An idea struck him that perhaps these boxes had been piled up to conceal some passage leading out of the secret storeroom. He mentioned his suspicion to Joe. "But how could the men pile the boxes up there after they went out?" his brother questioned. This gang is smart enough for anything. Let's move these boxes away and maybe we'll find out. Frank seized the topmost box. It was very lightly, and he removed it from the pile without difficulty. I thought so, Frank said with satisfaction. The flashlight had revealed the top of a door, which had been hidden from view. The boys lost no time in moving the other 3 boxes. Then Frank and Joe discovered how it was possible for the boxes to be piled up in such a position, in spite of the fact that the smugglers had left the case and closed the door behind them. Attached to the bottom of the door was a thin wooden platform that projected out over the floor of the cave, and on this the boxes had been piled. Very clever, Joe remarked. Whenever anyone leaves the cave and closes the door, the boxes swing in with the platform, and it looks as though they were piled up on the floor. Right. Well, let's see where the door leads, Frank proposed. He snapped off his light with an utmost caution, opened the door. It made no sound. Again, there was darkness ahead. What a maze, Frank whispered as he turned on his flash and beamed the light ahead. Another stone-lined passage with a flight of steps at the end. Suddenly Frank stiffened and laid a warning hand on his brother's arm. "Voices," he said in a low tone, and snapped off his light. The boys listened intently. They could hear a man's voice in the distance. Neither would distinguish what he was saying, for he was still too far away, but gradually the tones grew louder. Then the boys, to the brothers' alarm, they heard footsteps. Hastily they retreated into the secret cave. "Quick, the door!" Frank urged. They closed it quietly. "Now the boxes. If those men come in here, they'll notice that the boxes have been moved." He turned on the light, but shielded it with his hand. Swiftly Joe piled the empty boxes back onto the platform that projected from the bottom of the door. He worked as silently and quickly as possible, but could hear the footsteps drawing closer and closer. Finally, the topmost box was in place. "Out the other door!" Frank hissed onto Joe's ear. They sped across the floor of the cave towards the door's opening onto the stairs they had recently ascended. But hardly they had reached it before they heard a rattle on the latch of the door at the opposite side of the cave. "We haven't time," Frank whispered. "Hide!" The beam of the flashlight revealed a number of boxes close to the door. On top of these, someone had thrown a heavy bolt of silk, the folds of which hung to the floor. The brothers scrambled swiftly behind the boxes, pressing themselves close against the wall. They had just enough time to hide and switch out Frank's light before they heard the other door open. "There's a bunch of drugs in that shipment that came in here 3 weeks ago," they heard a husky voice say. "We'll take it upstairs. Burke says he can get rid of it for us right away. No use leaving it down here. Got to make room for the new shipment." "Right." The Hardys heard someone else reply. "Anything else to go up?" "No. I'll switch on the light." There was a click, and suddenly the cave was flooded with light. It had been wired for electricity. Frank and Joe crouched in their hiding place, holding their breaths in terror. Would they be discovered? Footsteps slowly approached the boxes, behind which they were concealed. Chapter 13. A Startling Discovery. Frank and Joe tried to crowd themselves into the smallest space possible as the men came nearer to their hiding place. The electric light bulb hanging from the center of the ceiling cast such strong illumination over the cave that the boys felt certain they would be discovered. The boxes were placed in small distances apart, and only the fact that folds of silk hung down over the open spaces between the boxes prevented the boys from being seen immediately. However, through a crack in one of the crates, the Hardys could just make out 2 husky-looking figures. "Here is some of that Japanese silk," the boys heard one of the men say. "I better take a bolt of that up too. Burke said he could place some more of it." Instantly the same thought ran through both of the brothers' minds. If the man picked up the silk, they would surely be found. "Don't be crazy," the other man objected. "You know you won't get any credit for pushing a sail. Why break your arm lugging all this stuff upstairs?" "Well," said the first man, explained in a whining tone, "I thought maybe we could get rid of more of this swag and make ourselves a little extra dough." "Nah," his companion snarled. "I can tell you ain't been in this gang long. You never get any thanks around here for thinking. If Burke don't take the extra stuff, the boss will make you bring it all the way down again." "And maybe you're right." "Sure I'm right. My idea for the rest of us in this gang is just do what Snapman tells us and no more." "You got something here, bud. Okay, we'll just take the package of drugs and leave the rest." To the boys' relief, the men turned away and went over to the other side of the room. Frank and Joe did not dare peer out, but they could hear the sound of boxes being shifted. Then came the words. "All set. We've got the packages. Let's go." The switch was snapped and the cave was plunged into darkness. The Hardys began to breathe normally again. The door to the corridor closed, and faintly the boys could detect the men's footsteps as they ascended the stairs at the end of it. When they had died away completely, Frank switched on the flashlight. "Wow," he said, giving a tremendous sigh of relief. "That was a close call. I sure thought they'd find us." "Me too," Joe agreed. "We wouldn't have had a chance with the pair. Looked like a couple of wrestlers." "Would we dare follow them?" "Well, you bet. I'd say we solved the smuggling mystery, but we still got to find out if they are holding Dad," Joe said grimly. "We have to watch our steps even more carefully. We don't want to walk right into the whole ring of smugglers," Frank reminded him. "Right. I don't crave anything worse than what we've just gone through," said Joe. "I thought I'd die of suspense while the pair was in there." They crossed the room, opened the door, and started up the dark passageway. Presently they were confronted by the flight of the steps. Part way up there was a landing, then more steps with a door on the top. "I'll go first," Frank offered. "Stick close behind me. I think I'll keep the flash off." "That's right," Joe agreed. "Snapman might have a guard at the top, and there's no use advertising our presence." Step by step, the boys crept upward in the inky blackness. Then they found themselves on a crude landing of planks. Carefully, they felt their way along the side of the rocks wall until they reached the next flight of steps. Here the brothers stopped again to listen. Silence. "So far, so good," Frank whispered. "But somehow I don't like this whole thing. I have a feeling we're walking into a trap." "We can't quit now," Joe answered. "But I admit I'm scared." Still groping in the dark, the boys climbed up and up until they were nearly winded. "Where are we?" Joe panted. "I feel as if I've been climbing stairs for an hour." "Me too," Frank agreed. "The cliff doesn't look like this from the outside." They rested a minute, then continued their journey. Groping around, they finally reached another door. Frank hunted for the door handle. Finding it, he turned the knob ever so slightly to find out the door was locked. "I can open it," Frank said in Joe's ear, "but we better wait a few minutes." "Every second is right-left that is a prisoner," Joe objected. Frank was about to accede to his brother's urging when both boys heard footsteps on the other side of the door. A chill ran down their spines. "Shall we run?" Joe said fearfully. "It wouldn't do us any good. Listen." There came a queer shuffling sound and a sigh from somewhere beyond the door. That was all. "Somewhere's in there," Frank breathed. Joe nodded in the darkness. The boys did not know what to do. Their gang might have posted a sentry. If there was only one, the Hardys might be able to jump the man and disarm him. However, they probably could not do it without making some noise and attracting the attention of the rest of the smugglers. Frank and Joe gritted their teeth. They couldn't give up now. As they were trying to decide how to proceed, the situation took an unexpected turn. A door slammed in the distance. Then came the murmur of voices and the sound of advancing footsteps. "This nonsense has gone far enough," a man said angrily. "He'll write that note at once, or I know the reason why." The boys started. The voice was that of the man who had ordered them to leave the pond during the afternoon. "That's right, Chief," another voice spoke up. "Make him do as you say, or get the heat off until we got all the loot moved. If he doesn't write it, he'll never get out of here alive," the first man promised coldly. Instantly Frank and Joe thought of the note their mother had received. Was the man these smugglers were talking about their father? Or was he someone else, maybe Jones, who was to be forced to obey them or perhaps lose his life? The speakers went a short distance beyond the door behind which Frank and Joe were standing. Then they heard the click of a switch. A faint beam of yellow light shone beneath the door. The brothers figured there was a corridor beyond, and the 3 or 4 men had entered the room opening from it. "Well, I see you are still here," said the man who had been addressed as Chief. "You find this is an easier place to get into than out." A weary voice answered him. The tones were low, so the boys pressed closer to the door, but try as they might, they could not distinguish the words. "You're a prisoner here, and you stay here until you die unless you write that note." Again the weary voice spoke, but the tones were still so indistinct that the boys could not hear the answer. "You won't write it, eh? We'll see what we can do to persuade you." "Let him go hungry for a few days. That will persuade him," put in one of the other men. This brought a hoarse laugh on his companions. "You'll be hungry enough if you don't write that letter," the chief agreed. "Are you going to write it?" "No." The boys barely heard the prisoner's answer. The chief said sourly, "You've gotten too much on us. We can't afford to let you go now. But if you write that letter, we'll leave you some food so that you won't starve. You'll break out eventually, but not in time to do us any harm. Well, what do you say? Want some food?" There was no reply from the prisoner. "Give his arm a little twist," suggested one of the smugglers. At this the Hardys boys boiled with rage. The first impulse was to fling open the door and rush to the aid of the person who was being tormented, but they realized they were helpless against so many men. Their only hope lay in the arrival of the Coast Guard men, but they might come too late. "Chief, shall I give this guy the works?" one of the smugglers asked. "Nah," the leader answered quickly. "None of the rough stuff. We'll do it the easy way, starvation. I'm giving him one more chance. He can write the note now, or we'll leave him here to starve when we make our getaway." Still there was no reply. To Frank and Joe's ears came a scraping sound, as if a chair was being moved forward. "You won't talk, eh?" The leader's voice grew ugly. There was a pause of a few seconds, then suddenly he shouted, "Write that note, Hardy, or you will be sorry, as sure as my name is Snapman." Chapter 14. Captured. Joe gave a start. "It is dead," he whispered hoarsely. "He found the smuggler's hideout." Frank nudged his brother warningly. "Not so loud." The boys' worst fears were realized. Their father was not only a prisoner of the smugglers, but also his life was being threatened. "Write that note," Snapman demanded. "I won't write it," Fenton Hardy replied in a weak but clear voice. The chief persisted. "You heard what I say. Write it, or I'll be left here to starve." "I'll starve." "You'll change your mind in a day or two. You think you're hungry now, but wait until we cut off the food entirely. Then you'll see. You'll be ready to sell your soul for a drop of water or a crumb to eat." "I won't write." "Look here, Hardy. We are not asking very much. All we want you to do is to write your wife that you are safe Tell her to call off the police and those kids of yours. They're too nosy." "Sooner or later someone is going to trace me here," came Mr. Hardy's faint reply. "And when they do, I can tell them enough to send you to prison for the rest of your life." There was a sudden commotion in the room, and 2 or 3 of the smugglers began talking at once. "You're crazy!" shouted Snapman, but there was a hint of uneasiness in his voice. "You don't know anything about me." "I know enough, and I have to have you sent up for attempted murder, and you're about to try it again." "You're too smart, Hardy. That's all the more reason why you're not going to get out of here until we've gone. And if you don't cooperate, you will never make it. Our next big shipment's coming through tonight, and then we're skipping the country. If you write that letter, you'll live. If you don't, it's curtains for you." Frank and Joe were shaken by the dire threats, but they must decide whether to go for help or stay and risk capture and try to rescue their father. "You don't scare me, Snapman," the detective said. "I have a feeling your time is up. You're never going to get that big shipment." The detective's voice seemed a little stronger, the boys felt. Snapman laughed. "I thought you were smart, but you're just playing a losing game, I warn you. And how about your family? What are you going to do service to them by being so stubborn?" There was a silence for a while. Then Fenton Hardy answered slowly, "My wife and boys would rather know what I died doing my duty than have come my back to them as a protector of smugglers and criminals." "You have a very high sense of duty," sneered Snapman, "but you'll change your mind. Are you thirsty?" There was no reply. "Are you hungry?" Still no answer. "I know you are, and it'll be worse. You die of thirst and starvation until you write that note." "I'll never write it." "All right, come on, man. We'll leave him to himself for a while and give him time to think about it." Frank squeezed Joe's arm in relief and exhilaration. There was still a chance to save their father. Footsteps echoed as Snapman and the others left the room and walked through the corridor. Finally the sounds died away and the door slammed. Joe made a move towards the door, but Frank held him back. "We better wait 1 minute," he cautioned. They may have left someone on guard." The boy stood still, listening intently, but there were no further sounds from beyond the door. At length, satisfied that his father had indeed been left alone, Frank felt for the knob. Noiselessly he opened the door about an inch, then peered into the corridor, which was dimly lighted from the overhead bulb. But there was no sign of a guard. 3 doors opened from the corridor, 2 on the opposite side from where the brothers were standing, and another at the end. The passage was floored with planks, and had been ceiling like a cellar. Frank and Joe quickly figured that their father was where their father was, and sped across the planks to the room. They pushed open the door of the almost dark room and peered inside. There was a crude table and several chairs. In one corner stood a small cot. On it lay Fenton Hardy. He was bound hand and foot to the bed, and so tightly trussed that he was unable to move more than a few inches in any direction. He was flat on his back, staring up at the ceiling of his prison. On a chair beside the cot was a sheet of paper and a pencil, evidently the materials for the letters Snapman had demanded to write. "Dad!" Frank and Joe cried softly. The detective had not heard the door open, but now he looked at his sons in amazement and relief. "You're here," he whispered. "Thank goodness." The boys were shocked at the change in their father's appearance. Normally a rugged-looking man, Fenton Hardy was now thin and pale. His cheeks were sunken and his eyes listless. "We'll have you out of here in a minute," Frank whispered. "Hurry," the detective begged. "Those demons may be back any minute." Frank pulled out his pocket-knife and began to work at the ropes that bound his father. But the knife was not very sharp and the bonds were thick. Joe discovered that he did not have his knife with him. "It probably slipped out of my pocket when we undressed on the Napoli," he said. "Mine is gone too," Mr. Hardy told them. "Snapman took everything I had in my pockets, including concentrated emergency rations. Have you anything sweet with you?" Joe pulled out the candy bar from his pocket and held it so Mr. Hardy could take a large bite of the quick energy food. Meanwhile his eyes roamed over the room in search of something sharp which he might use to help Frank with the rope, but he saw nothing. Mr. Hardy finished the candy bar bite by bite. Now Joe started to help Frank by trying to untie the knots, but they were tight, and he found it almost impossible to loosen them. Minutes passed. Frank hacked at the ropes, but the dull blade made little progress. Joe worked at the obstinate knots. Fenton Hardy could give no assistance. All were silent. The only sound was the heavy breathing of the boys and the scraping of the knife against the ropes. At last Frank was able to saw through one of the bonds, and the detective's feet were free. His son pulled the ropes away and began to work on the ones that bound his father's arm. As he reached over with the knife, there came a sound that sent a feeling of terror through the Hardys. It was a heavy footstep beyond the corridor. Someone was coming back. Frank worked desperately with the knife, but the rope still held stubbornly. The dull blade seemed to make almost no impression, but at last a few strands parted. Finally, with Fenton Hardy making a mighty effort and Joe clawing at the rope with his fingers, it snapped. The detective was free. But the footfalls and the approaching smuggler came closer. "Quick!" Frank whispered, as he flung the ropes aside. I can't hurry," Mr. Hardy gasped. "I've been tied here for so long. My feet and legs are numb." "But we've got to hurry, Dad," Frank said excitedly. "See if you can stand up." I'll do my best," his father replied, as the boy rubbed his legs vigorously to restore full circulation. "We must run before those crooks come," Joe said tensely. Fenton Hardy got to his feet as hastily as he could, but when he stood up the detective staggered and would have fallen if Frank had not taken his arm. He was so weak from hunger that a wave of dizziness had come over him. He gave his head a quick shake and the feeling passed. "All right, let's go," he said, clinging to both boys for support. The three hastened out the door of the room, across the corridor of the cave. As they entered it, Mr. Hardy's knee buckled. In desperation, his sons picked him up. "You go on," he whispered. "Leave me here." "I'm sure all of us can make it," Joe said bravely. They reached the far door, but the delay had been costly. Just as Frank opened it, clicking off his flashlight, the corridor door was flung open and the ceiling light snapped on. Frank and Joe had a confused glimpse of the dark man whom they had seen in the pond in the afternoon. Snapman. Two rough-looking companions crowded in behind him. "What's going on here?" Snapman exclaimed, apparently not recognizing the group for a moment. "It's the Hardys!" one of the other men cried. The fleeing trio started down the steps, but got no farther than the landing when the smugglers appeared in the stairway and then rushed down after them. "Stop!" cried Snapman, jumping down the last 3 steps and whipping an automatic from his pocket. The place was flooded with light. As Snapman grew closer, Frank crouched for a spring, then leaped directly at the smuggler. He struck at the man's wrist, and the revolver flew out of his grasp. It skidded across the landing and clattered down the steps. Frank closed in on the man. Snapman had been taken completely by surprise, but before he could defend himself, Frank forced him against the wall. Joe, in the meantime, with a swift uppercut, he had KO'd one of the other men, and Mr. Hardy, whose strength had partially returned, was battling the third as best as he could. But at this moment the boys saw their father's adversary dodge to the wall and press a button. In an instant an alarm bell sounded in the corridor.
Within seconds, a new group of Snapman's gang appeared. As some held drawn revolvers, others overpowered the three Hardys. In the face of the guns, father and sons were forced to surrender and return to the room where Mr. Hardy had been held captive before. Within 5 minutes, Fenton Hardy was bound again to the cot, while Frank and Joe, trussed up and unable to move, were tied down into 2 chairs.